You're in the water loop.
Waterloop is made possible in part by grants from Spring Point Partners and the Walton Family Foundation.
Waterloop.
Hey, this is Travis with Waterloop. I want to tell you a story about High Sierra Showerheads, who I'm proud to have as a sponsor of this podcast, particularly because they make incredibly water-efficient showerheads. I've talked with owner David Malcolm about growing up in California, learning about the importance of water and energy efficiency from his father. David has been designing high-efficiency nozzles for agriculture and golf courses for the past 30 years. The golf course people actually came to him wanting a nozzle that produced a uniform spray but was water efficient. So David went in and designed a nozzle that explodes a low pressure stream of water into a shower of large, powerful droplets. David actually thought this would make a great showerhead, and that's how High Sierra Showerheads was born. And nobody has their nozzle technology. It's patented, and you get a great shower while saving water. Use promo code LOOP20 for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
You're in the water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. Going to talk all about the ocean and ocean policy, joined by Eric Schwaab. He is Senior Vice President of Oceans and Ecosystems at the Environmental Defense Fund. Eric, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Travis. Really happy to be here with you.
So the ocean is a big place, right? I think 70% of our planet is covered by ocean. We're not going to talk about all of that today. I really wanted to focus a bit domestically, when it comes to U.S. ocean policy and maybe the U.S. portion of the ocean, if you will. Could you help define that a little better for people as we make that delineation?
Sure. So the ocean domestically is out to the 200-mile limit. So states control the first few miles, and then 3 miles out to 200 miles is controlled by federal agencies or the federal government, and the rest beyond that are shared high seas areas beyond national jurisdiction, both from the U.S. perspective as well as globally.
So domestic policy is really about what happens within those 200 miles from shore, the decisions we make as a country and how we manage our resources in that area, if you will.
Right. And that's defined particularly as an exclusive economic zone. So we control what goes on there. It has largely its origins in fisheries management and policy, but extends much now beyond to lots of other activities that might occur in that part of the ocean.
Okay. Well, as we talk about problems and challenges, I know there are many when it comes to the ocean. But what would you say are kind of like our biggest, most critical problems right now? If the kind of the top of that list when it comes to the domestic side of our ocean.
Yeah. So the biggest overarching problem, and it's not unique to the U.S., is climate-driven shifts. So the ocean has absorbed a lot of the warming associated with climate pollution over decades, and that's catching up to us. We're seeing impacts to fish productivity and distribution, habitats all around our coasts, as well as to chemistry and physical aspects, ocean acidification, potential shifts in ocean currents, that are all these kind of big sort of overarching challenges that we face. Beyond that, we've got localized pollution. So we've got nutrient-based pollutions in places like the Gulf of Mexico and Chesapeake Bay that originate far upstream. We've got plastics pollution. All of those are having big impacts. We have big nutrient-driven dead zones in many inshore waters that have significant impacts on people and fish and other aquatic resources. And of course, historically, we've had in the U.S. Big problems associated with overfishing. Those overfishing problems aren't gone, but they are largely in a lot better control now in a lot of places than they ever have been, at least in recent history.
I'd like to kind of to pick on a few of those problems for a second and ask you about them. So the fishing one, commercial fishing, I don't know. I guess I assume that when people hear about the overfishing of the oceans, they think that's really an international problem. That's something that's driven by other countries, that's driven, out in the Pacific Ocean, by Asia. But the U.S. has historically contributed to this overfishing from a commercial sense, or continues to. What's kind of our role in that?
Well, sure. Yeah, it's less a problem in the U.S. now than it used to be. The U.S. Federal Fisheries Law, which is the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act, was reauthorized back in 2006, 2007. It, for the first time, set requirements to end overfishing and to rebuild depleted stocks in a time-certain period for all federally managed fisheries. That time period was in like the 2010, 2011 time period. And we have made tremendous strides in rebuilding overfished stocks, rebuilding abundance, in ending overfishing in many of our federally managed fisheries. And in fact, in many ways, that positioned the U.S. to become a model around the world for effective science-based, sustainable fisheries management. That's not to say that's a problem that is completely behind us. We have ongoing challenges in some places. It's also a problem that is going to be challenged again as climate-driven shifts move fish in and out of different jurisdictional boundaries. But we're in a lot better place than we have been for a long, long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also on the marine species. So I think it's climate is the real impact here with ocean acidification, with warming temperatures and all those changes. That's really having a negative impact on a lot of the sea creatures out there, huh?
Yeah, and I mean that's not to say we have had and continue to have bycatch issues. Mm-hmm. We have entanglement issues with fishing gear that affects turtles and whales and bycatch of seabirds and sharks and other species of concern. But again, many steps have been taken to reduce those bycatch issues. That is an ongoing challenge. But again, exacerbated again by the fact that species are moving into new places. Patterns have shifted as climate-driven shifts redistribute ideal habitat and redistribute forage or target species for prey around the world. So these are all sort of real-time issues that we continue to have to wrestle with.
Mm. And I wanted to ask about energy, along the coast and offshore. You always hear about drilling. That was a big push the past bunch of years, even along the Atlantic coast. And there's, of course, incidents that continue to happen. But is that not a huge factor at the moment because it's not happening in a widespread fashion, or is offshore energy still a concern? Is it contributing to problems? What's the situation there?
Well, we're going through a much more positive shift, right? Where we're moving from a focus on oil and gas exploration offshore, which has myriad of problems as well as some impact to users, to one that is focused on renewable energy offshore. And while we're very much in the early stages of that, and there will be some potential site-based conflicts to address along the way, obviously focusing on renewable energy sources as opposed to carbon-based energy sources is going to be a big step forward for the oceans in total. We'll still have to have lots of discussion around potential conflicts between wind sites and fishing activities and shipping and other traditional uses of the ocean. But we're much better off having those discussions than we might be having discussions around conflicts with oil and gas exploration.
Yeah, no doubt. One of the things I hear a lot about is aquaculture too, offshore aquaculture or in the ocean aquaculture, right? What's the prevalence of that, and is that a concern, or is that a good step towards sustainability if done properly?
So there are a range of different kinds of aquaculture, even in the marine environment. We have a pretty long history of successful shellfish aquaculture in various parts of the country, largely inshore. And you can think about shellfish as very restorative in nature, right? While shellfish aquaculture might take up space in the coastal system, those are animals that are out there filtering water, creating very carbon efficient protein, and providing local economic activity in port communities. Take that then a step further and think about things like finfish aquaculture, and you have some more challenges to deal with. And this is not something that has been where the U.S. has been leading the way. In fact, we import the vast majorities of the seafood that we consume in this country, either from wild capture or from aquaculture. And much of that, and half of what we consume in this country today, roughly, comes from aquaculture produced fish elsewhere. There are issues and opportunities associated with that, right? We don't have a lot of understanding of the local impacts in other parts of the world that result from that aquaculture production. So we've all heard stories of, for example, destruction of coastal mangrove systems to create shrimp farms. That's not to say that that's the sort of even the prevalent practice in other parts of the world, but those are impacts that we are not seeing and are sort of largely exported while we import our fish. One of the things we learned during COVID was that pretty complicated seafood supply chains aren't really in our best interest economically or from a food security perspective. So there's a lot of really important discussion right now in this country about where we are going to procure animal-based protein in the future. How can we bring that onshore to the U.S. to realize the economic opportunities associated with that, to get more control over our food supplies, and to make sure that they're produced in the most environmentally effective way possible. So we're very much engaged now in a conversation about what the future of finfish aquaculture off of U.S. coasts could or should look like. And if we're going to do it, how do we do it in environmentally responsible and sustainable ways? And how do we do it in a way that, like we did with wild capture fisheries under the Magnuson Act, can become a model for sustainable marine aquaculture production in the U.S. In the same way that we have become a model for sustainable marine capture fisheries?
A lot to sort out with that, for sure. Let's talk about the policy side. We are, in a new administration. We're in a new Congress. When there's a change like that, there's always a look at, well, here's the policies that need to be changed. Here's what we'd like them to be. So, as you all advocate for policy changes, what's kind of the top of your list? And go ahead and be detailed. What's broken, and what would you guys like to change those policies to?
Okay, well, we already talked about a couple of the big ones, right? One is obviously shifting our dependence away from carbon-based energy sources to renewable energy sources. That's going to be one of the most important steps that we can take globally, but also for the oceans themselves. And so, doing that will create a lot of important discussions about where, how, and when. And how that happens in relation to other traditional uses like sustainable fisheries. The second one, which we touched on, is aquaculture. And is there an opportunity for us in the context of global, protein production and global food security and domestic food security to sort of bring more of that production onshore? To provide that economic opportunity, to provide that sustainable productivity in a more domestic context. I think we talk a lot about the needs. Putting climate aside for a minute, to protect, to continue progress on sustainable fisheries, but also to do a better job of protecting special habitats, to protect other species like whales and sharks and turtles and seabirds, and do that more responsibly. And one of the things that we've heard a lot about from the Biden administration is their 30 by 30 initiative, which focuses on, in the ocean environment, more sort of protected areas that are off limits to a lot of the traditional ocean uses that we imagine. And we're very much engaged in that conversation as well.
Yeah, the 30 by 30 is something I wanted to dig into a little bit because I've seen it out there in the news and on social media and all kinds of people saying, I endorse the 30 by 30, So it's like protecting 30% of the ocean and 30% of even the land by the year 2030. That's the basic concept, right?
Right.
How feasible is that? I know that there's big hurdles. There's always politics involved. What about it looking at just the U.S., the idea of us moving toward that? I've always thought marine protected areas are amazing when they're really properly done and those areas are off limits. They let life rebound and spill out and provide a wealth of resources outside of those areas. But yeah, just how does this 30 by 30 possibility look to you guys?
So I think our basic view, Travis, is that protected areas have a very important place in the ocean conservation agenda. So we see that kind of a flag planted in the ground as a very important point from which to have discussions. I think that the considerations that we want to make sure happen is that it's that we ensure that the conversation is just not about that 30%, but about the other 70%. And the most effective marine protected areas are ones that are complemented by sustainable management principles around them. They're also very effective if local people in those places sort of appreciate them, see the benefits that are derived from the protected areas, and therefore are party to sort of ensuring their protection and survival, for decades to come. And finally, we think that protecting the right 30 means that we have to have a really strong climate lens to the evaluation. So the 30% that might be protecting certain habitats or species today might have to be a different 30% tomorrow. Now, you can argue that, that is significant enough to allow species and habitats to shift over time as climate-driven shifts occur. But we think that there needs to be an important sort of climate lens to the overall discussion. So we're at a very, I think, pretty early stage in sort of those conversations. They're conversations that have to engage local communities and users. There are conversations that have to take into account the best available science, both today as well as it might be impacted by climate into the future. And there are also conversations that aren't unto themselves going to be the solution. They have to be complemented by sustainable management practices and principles, on the rest of the ocean.
I know that when it comes to the fishing side, which you've talked about a lot, there's a lot of people that make their livelihoods off this, and they're working hard and they're scraping to fish and pay the bills and all that kind of thing. And when they hear a lot of the talk about boxing areas off or putting in new regulations, that can they can resist, if you will,
right,
or be concerned. How do you approach that from a relationship standpoint? How do you try to find a middle ground with, the commercial fishing sector?
Yeah, there are other parts of the world, Travis, where, we're engaged in exactly those discussions. And, just drawing lines on a map aren't going to lead to the kinds of protections that that you might aspire to through a protected area strategy. But if you can engage local people in discussions about the value of those protected areas in sort of as source areas for spawning or important habitats that critical species depend upon as a part of their life cycle, and they can see the benefits through increased increased sustainability or productivity of those species kind of outside of those protected areas, that gets to this kind of 100% solution that I'm talking about. So, there are parts of the world where, local peoples are seeing exactly that dynamic play out. This protected area over here yields better and more sustainable fisheries opportunities over there. They see that benefit. They defend then the integrity of the protected area, and they still manage to pursue their livelihoods effectively. Now, obviously there are all kinds of different sort of gradations of that dynamic, but that's the kind of conversation that we think is most effective for everybody involved.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I know from my work in the Chesapeake Bay area, even in an estuary like that, where the watermen are such a big part of the economy and the culture, and the crabs and the oysters, and having to put regulations on those, it was always a lot of of give and take and tension and negotiations for sure. I want to ask about the climate thing. So I can see how addressing climate change helps the ocean, right? If you keep the temperature from rising and all this kind of thing, that benefits the ocean. How do certain measures for the ocean's benefit help with this addressing climate change challenge?
Right. Well, we've already talked a little bit about how historically the ocean absorbed much of the temperature change. We also know that the ocean absorbs a lot of the carbon that has been produced. So we talk a lot these days about nature-based climate solutions, and whether those be, a lot of people know about the uptake of carbon by trees and the storage of carbon in tree biomass. There's increasing discussion about uptake of carbon in agricultural soils. Well, we also know, as you said earlier, 2/3 of the world is covered by ocean, and there's a tremendous amount of biological activity that goes on there. So there are clearly nature-based climate solutions that are part of a healthy ocean ecosystem. We know about or think a lot more about what that means in coastal mangrove systems, in salt marshes, in seagrasses inshore. We know those systems take up and store carbon. Mangroves at a very high rate, although their global footprint is relatively small. Increasingly, there's attention to seaweeds, kelp, other products that are either grown or harvested in the wild for human consumption and other use. But increasingly we know that seaweeds have a very large sort of global footprint, and if restored and protected, can be a big part of the carbon sort of uptake and capture solution. But what's only now beginning to get popularly a little more conversation is the exchange of carbon in the open ocean environment, and the role that large marine animals like whales play in sort of stimulating a local ecosystem that facilitates more sort of algal growth and uptake, and that productivity is consumed and then is ultimately in significant amounts released into the deep ocean bottom through what's often referred to as marine snow, waste products from animals in the food chain. And we know that there are large stores of carbon in marine sediments, even in deep ocean environments, that need to be protected there, but also can be enhanced through protection of large marine animals, a healthy ocean environment that will lead to greater, not only continued, but potentially greater uptake of carbon from the atmosphere at the open ocean interface.
All that just reminds me why I love the ocean so much, and it inspires me. That's so awesome. Just thinking about the power of seaweed and kelp and all the grasses, and mangroves are amazing. Shifting back, last couple questions here. Short-term policy stuff. What's coming up here? What are the real opportunities? What's the administration looking at right now, or Congress looking at? You guys looking at that? Trying to move in the near term.
Yeah, I think there are a number of elements to that, Travis. I mean, one is, we're super excited about the leadership of the Biden administration, back into the global climate discussion. President Biden has announced a leadership summit on climate next week to coincide with Earth Day. As part of that, there is going to be a special session hosted by John Kerry and Jane Lubchenco, who many of us know well, both of whom have come back into this administration to help advance the climate agenda. And they're going to be talking specifically about the ocean climate interface and some of the opportunities we've just referred to. I think we're talking a lot about infrastructure. And importantly, there are great discussions around resilience investments. We know that our coastal communities are challenged physically, they're challenged economically, and to the greater extent that we can invest in our coastal communities, we can position them to be a part of this ocean solution that we're talking about, whether that be as launch points for construction of new wind power sites, to aquaculture opportunities, to sustainable marine fisheries, as part of the domestic food solution. All of those things I think are going to dovetail very nicely with not only our return to the climate discussion, but with our emphasis on sort of rebuilding our domestic capacity, not just from an environmental perspective, but from a jobs and economic viability perspective. And I think the coasts are going to be an important part of that discussion. Clearly we're going to continue to have conversations about 30 by 30, although, I think that's kind of be initially more of an administrative set of discussions than it is a legislative one. But that's an important conversation as well. And I think sort of rejoining the global dialogue and establishing ourselves as a global player around not just climate, but around ocean health is going to be an important part of the immediate discussion as well.
Yeah. Well, you hit on the blue economy, they call it, right? The idea that, that taking care of the ocean can be a huge economic driver.
Right.
Lastly, I just want to ask, where you sit on the scale of optimism about the future of a sustainable ocean. I started out talking about these tremendous challenges, the variety of challenges, but how do you feel about the future of the ocean?
Right. Well, I am optimistic, Travis, and I'm optimistic because, first of all, this renewed attention that the U.S. is bringing to the game is very important. But I also think there are people around the world that sort of understand the interdependence between, their livelihoods, their very sort of, survival and, healthy ocean ecosystems. So there's a huge amount of focus. There's a huge amount of energy and enthusiasm that is being put forth both in the U.S. and around the world. And there are also sort of great breakthroughs in technologies, in science that are allowing us to understand, as we've talked already, the important role that oceans can play and how we can help the oceans to play that role. So, I think we have sort of no choice but to act. And I think we certainly have the wherewithal to act. And I think today we have the focus and the commitment to act, and we just need to press forward in that regard. Yeah.
Well, I think that, the back part of this conversation, some of your optimism rubbed off on me talking about those solutions and opportunities. It's exciting, especially science and technology, and when we kind of harness all these opportunities out there. But Eric, I appreciate the time a lot. Great perspective, great information, and look forward to kind of following all this in the months and years ahead.
Thank you, Travis. It's been great to be with you, and really, glad you brought the focus to this set of issues.
Thanks.
Waterloop.
If you like Waterloop, please subscribe to the YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on social media and visit waterloop.org to sign up for updates.
Waterloop, Waterloop, Waterloop.